You're on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bloomsday Montreal Sunday edition. I'm Kathleen Fee. I'm the artistic director of Bloomsday Montreal. I'm at home, and we have with us Donovan King, who is down in Old Montreal with his tour group, and they're just gathering. And hi, Donovan.
Hi,
Um,
Ken.
we have a
How are
number
you?
of people here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Um, yeah, so I was just saying for our online audience that I'm at home, you're downtown, and you're gathering your gang together. And how's it going? Are people gathering?
Yes, I believe most of the people are here, so we might be missing one or two, but we're going to be starting shortly.
Okay, great. And is the route that you're taking today the same one that we filmed last year?
No, this is a totally different tour. So last year it was a tour about the Irish famine in Montreal and some of the issues with Irish heritage, desecration by the REM, and things like renaming the station after Bernard Laundrie and sinking a pylon through the cemetery and things like that. Whereas this year, the tour is a look at post-colonial Old Montreal from an Irish perspective. And so it's this idea of what we're seeing recently with things like statues being toppled and truth and reconciliation happening. And so to look at some of those issues from a post-colonial point of view, which sort of interrogates colonialism with a view of challenging it towards decolonizing. And so that's sort of what the tour is about today here in Old Montreal.
Wow. And is this something that you've developed for us, or is this something that you're working on for the summer?
I developed this specifically for the Bloomsday Festival, as a matter of fact, but I do intend to polish the tour and offer it later on during the summer because it's a very timely topic. People are sort of tired of the old type of walking tour where they just point out buildings and churches and things like that. People want more information about what's happening politically in terms of these commemorations, because there is sort of a war, a cultural war, if you will, happening, all across the world, but including especially here in Montreal.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, I'll certainly have to sign up for it later in the summer, so I'll keep in touch with you.
Okay.
Would you like to introduce us to any of the people who are there, or just swing your camera around so that the viewers at home can see where you are on a beautiful sunny day in Old Montreal?
Yeah, so we've got, I guess, I'll try to figure this out. Okay, so as you can see, we have some of our guests here, including some Bloomsday people as well, like Kevin, who's doing photography.
Great.
So we have about 15 people here at the moment.
Okay, well, it looks great. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Showing off the beauties of Old Montreal with the lovely church, and of course the Bank of Montreal is on the other side, and it was the oldest skyscraper in North America, wasn't it? That sort of sandstone building. I used to have a doctor in there, and they've got this. It was one of the first buildings with an elevator or something.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, phenomenal. All right. Well, listen, I won't keep you any longer. I think we can thank you very much for talking to our people. We know now who you are, and we're going to be able to see you on the film that you've shot last year. And with that beautiful introduction to what you're up to, I think other people, aside from myself, will be interested in coming down and actually being with you in person at some point in the summer. So thanks again.
Thank
And
you.
enjoy your walk.
Happy Bloomsday Festival.
Happy Bloomsday.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Well, now you have it. You know who Donovan is. We're going to be seeing him in the film. And as he was saying, last year, he really did a tour about the famine and showed some of the, well, I don't need to tell you, you're going to watch it. So why don't I just shut up and we can roll the film. Edmund, have you got the film there?
We'll be rolling that in 10 seconds. Thank you, Kathleen.
Great.
My name is Donovan King, and I work with a company called Irish-Montreal Excursions. Today I'm going to be giving a virtual walking tour on behalf of the Bloomsday 2020 festival about the Irish famine's impact in Montreal in 1847. But before getting into it, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that today's tour will be taking place on the unceded Mohawk territory of Tiohtià:ke. Now, it's important to note that about 10,000 years ago, this area was underwater. As the waters receded and the river valley formed, islands began to pop out. And this is where the ancestors of the Mohawk people settled. They had a major trade center here on the island called Hodsiragan. The French call it Hochelaga. And for many, many thousands of years, this was a very bustling place as other First Nations came in from all over the place to trade. Now, at the beginning of the 1600s, Europeans began colonizing these lands. In particular, the French began colonizing first out east in places like Tadoussac, Port-Royal, Quebec City, and Trois-Rivières. And then in 1642, an organization called the Notre Dame Society for the Conversion of the Savage Peoples of New France, I kid you not, it was actually called that, decided to set up a religious colony here on the island of Tiohtià:ke. The colony was called Ville-Marie, and we can see here today, Pointe-à-Calière Museum is on the exact same site as that original colony. Now, it's interesting to note that there was actually Irish people in New France. A lot of people don't realize this. But what happened was when Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland in the early 1600s, he gave the Irish soldiers an option. He said you could either stay in Ireland under the penal laws and become second-class citizens, or you can go fight for a Catholic king in another country. And so many of them went to France and Spain, and those who went to France, some of them inevitably settled here in the colonies of what they called New France. And so that was about 5% of the population of New France. And through other history throughout the years, which I'll be talking about on the tour today, it means that about 40% of Quebecers actually have Irish blood. And so the story we're looking at today is a horrible story resulting from British colonization, but it does have a silver lining in that those Irish who did survive the famine went on to become citizens of this land, often as some of the best artists, politicians, teachers, and so forth. And so we're going to begin the tour down here by the waterfront, here in the old port. And so if you just follow me this way, please. This is Montreal's harbor, the old harbor at least, and this is really where the story begins in 1847 on the 5th of June when a ship arrived here, a steamer from Quebec City with a girl who was quite ill. The doctors diagnosed it as sunstroke. And just 2 days later, 3 more steamers arrived, disgorging 2,304 Irish refugees here on these wharves in the Calcutta-like heat. Many of them began dropping like flies. Many of them died, and many of them were buried randomly along the banks of the canal and here along the harbor. Now, to give you some backstory, what had happened in Ireland following these penal laws that were implemented is the Irish citizens became very much second class. They weren't allowed to own land, for example. And so they had to pay these Anglo-Protestant landlords to live on their land, and they would basically grow crops for the landlords and potatoes for themselves, which were quite nutritious. Now the problem was a potato blight struck Ireland in the 1840s, and it got progressively worse and worse. And soon people began starving, because when they tried to harvest the tubers, they pulled up inedible mush. Now, instead of supporting them, the landlords would often sort of send them away, evict them, and put them on what were known as coffin ships to send them to the four corners of the planet. And a coffin ship was essentially a Canadian lumber ship that would normally bring lumber to Liverpool, dump it, take on a ballast, and then return here to get more lumber. Now in this case, the ballast was human beings. The Irish were crammed below the decks in filthy conditions. There wasn't enough water for washing, only for drinking. The food wasn't nutritious enough. And if you wanted to use the toilet, you had to use a bucket. And so this created filthy conditions, which were the perfect breeding ground for a disease known as ship's fever or typhus. Now this is caused by a bacteria, the Rickettsi bacteria, which is spread through insects, things like lice, mites, spiders. And if an insect were to bite you and were you to scratch the wound, it would circulate for about 10 to 12 days, and then there would be an awful lot of horrible symptoms. Needless to say, in about 30% of cases, the people would die, and on those coffin ships, they were simply tossed overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. When they arrived in the river, they were quarantined on an island called Gros-Île near Quebec City, where there were doctors and a hospital. There's about 5,000 Irish buried there today. It's a National Historic Site that can be visited. But Gros-Île was unable to stop the spread of the typhus. And so the ships continued moving upriver. And as I mentioned, on the 5th of June, the first one arrived here. It was the beginning of a very long and difficult summer, as thousands and thousands of more refugees arrived every single week. By the end of the summer, over 75,000 refugees had landed here in Montreal Harbor for a city of only 50,000 people. So that would be like 6 million refugees arriving in Montreal today. So yes, this is where it all started. And we're going to continue moving along now to the Grey Nuns' mother house, so I can explain their role in this tragedy. And this here is the old Grey Nuns' mother house. This building played a very significant role during the Irish famine of 1847. Now, essentially, the Grey Nuns was an order set up by a lady named Marguerite Duville during the New France era. She would go on to become Canada's first female saint. But in 1847, the Mother Superior, her name was Mother McMullen, and about a week after the first ships arrived, she began hearing rumors about a humanitarian disaster unfolding in the fever sheds, and went over there to check for herself what exactly was going on. When she arrived at the sheds, she was horrified. The stench was overwhelming. She found the living and the dead cohabitating the same space. Babies were suckling on the teats of dead mothers. There were corpses lying all over the place. And so she immediately returned here to the mother house. And during the recreation hour, she assembled the sisters and she told them, and I quote, "The plague is contagious. In sending you there, I'm signing your death warrant. You're free to accept or refuse." Now, these being sisters, not a single one of them refused, having taken their vows, and they immediately went down to the sheds to begin the gruesome task of separating the living from the dead. Now, of course, because typhus is contagious, it wasn't long before the sisters here began to contract it, began to fall ill, and they were replaced by the Sisters of Providence, and then they were replaced by the Sisters of the Hôtel Dieu. Now, eventually, as the summer wore on, a lot of the nuns and other religious members began dying, of course, from the typhus. But luckily, we did have a great mayor by the name of John Easton Mills, who really tried to hold everything together. And so if it wasn't for these heroes, it would have been a lot worse for those famine refugees. And so we're going to continue along now to the Lachine Canal and move up there to the site of those first fever sheds. Now just over here we have the first famine cemetery from 1847, according to the research that was done. The fever sheds were located just over here behind you, and the burial ground was located in this area over here. Now, as I mentioned, there was only 2 fever sheds left from an epidemic of 1832, which was totally insufficient. So when the nuns arrived, they found a humanitarian disaster. Now, luckily, the mayor, John Easton Mills, sprang into action. He took charge of the site. He was seen here with his saw, his carpentry tools, building more fever sheds with his team of workers. He was also known at the hour of midnight to come here to personally care for the refugees by giving them water, listening to them, giving them hope. And so he was a very heroic mayor in the eyes of Montreal's Irish community. Now, I should probably mention that by the month of July, the Irish had begun to spread throughout Montreal, bringing with them the typhus. Montrealers themselves started to contract the disease and to die, and many people became very angry and demanded to know why had the mayor allowed these people into the city. They assembled on the Champ de Mars parade ground one evening, and they actually threatened to come here to the site of the sheds and to pick up these sheds and all of the refugees and to throw them into the St. Lawrence River. Now, luckily, the mayor tried to calm them down. He posted guards on every single bridge and lock here along the canal. He also ordered the steamers to go directly to a place called Windmill Point, about 1 kilometer south of here, and he moved all of the sheds down to Windmill Point, and he also doubled them. That's where we're going to end the tour today, at the Black Rock. But here at this site, which was eventually abandoned, we can see that today there's no commemoration whatsoever, despite the fact that so many important things happened here. For example, the Mohawk First Nation delivered a gift of 170 pounds in famine relief, even though they themselves were impoverished by the same British colonization. It was also here where orphans were collected, and Bishop Ignace Bourget would have those Irish orphans adopted into French families because they were all Catholic, and that is one of the many reasons why about 40% of Quebecers have Irish blood in them today. And finally, John Easton Mills, the mayor himself, I should probably mention, who was here at the site caring for those refugees, ended up contracting the typhus himself and dying in the month of November 1847, earning him the moniker Montreal's Martyr Mayor. And so despite the fact that this incredible history, this incredible compassion unfolded right here, where we now have a bicycle path, you know, it's really sad that there's no commemoration, especially because this is a burial ground. In 1876, as they were digging the Wellington Basin, we can see the lip of the basin right over here. So this extended inwards like this. They began pulling up skeletons, all sorts of skeletons. And at first they would just throw them in the garbage until a politician named Bernard Devlin intervened and instructed them, no, they must be buried in the Catholic cemetery on Mount Royal. But that means that anything on that side of the lip, which was the basin, would have been emptied, but anything on this side still has bodies under the ground. So there's literally bodies under my feet right now. And again, this is one more problem of Irish commemoration, or a lack of it here in the city. And that's something we're really trying to push the mayor to do, is to mark all of these sites in an appropriate manner. Now this is the Lachine Canal. Now it's important to note that most of the famine Irish wanted to continue moving westward. A lot of them wanted to move into the United States away from British colonization, but the problem is Montreal Island is really at the end of the road for any ships because it's surrounded by rapids. And so in 1821, the Lachine Canal was dug, largely by the Irish, I might add. And so the famine refugees really had to go 13 kilometers along this canal so they could continue moving westward. Now the problem was there was a major shortage of canal boats, and so there weren't enough boats to move these people, so a lot of them just struck out on foot to walk along the tow line, and of course many of them dropped like flies and were buried here along the banks of the canal as well. Now it's also important to note that about 50% of these refugees could not afford to move westward, and so they really had no choice but to move here into the Griff, or Griffintown, which today is of course a condo-choked neighborhood. But it has a really interesting history. You see, this land was eventually purchased by a man named Thomas McCord from the Nuns. And while he was away on a business trip in 1791 to the United Kingdom, one of his unscrupulous business associates actually sold his land behind his back to a certain Mrs. Mary Griffin, the wife of a soap factory owner. And Mrs. Griffin set about hiring an urban planner to lay out streets, lots that she could sell to build houses on. And when Thomas McCord returned, he found that there was a small community called Griffintown sitting on his land. He was furious. He tried to erase the name from streets and parks. He went to court, and while he did win his land back in court, the name Griffintown has stuck with us to this very day. Now, I should probably mention that when those refugees poured in there, this transformed into Canada's most notorious shanty town for well over a century, with all of the impoverished famine refugees pouring in there. So we're talking about ramshackle construction, no running water, people using privies. This created a breeding ground for all sorts of disease: typhus, typhoid, Spanish flu, smallpox. This would decimate the population again and again and again, not to mention all of the industrial accidents, floods, fires, murders, and far worse. You see, in the 1960s, the mayor, Jean Drapeau, decided to rezone the entire Griff as an industrial zone because he considered it an eyesore. He essentially drove this bridge, the Bonaventure Expressway, right through the neighborhood, and with his rezoning, it went from a height of 70,000 people to less than 1,000 in just the span of a few short years. Recently it's been rezoned again. This time it's the condominium crowd moving in, which is kind of unfortunate actually. Now, one of the problems that's been occurring here in the Griff is a commemoration problem. A lot of the Irish community have complained that our heritage hasn't been respected here. And the most obvious example that came up recently is this new train line that we're seeing here. It's called the REM, the Réseau Électrique de Montréal. And this train line, they're going to be building a station right here in Griffintown, and so one would assume it would be called Griffintown Station, but unfortunately in November the mayor decided that she wanted it named Griffintown Bernard Landry, after a politician. This did not go down very well with the Irish community, and many of us suggested that perhaps it would be better to rename the multimedia city after Mr. Landry, because that's actually what he built over there. Now, these are the ruins of St. Anne's Church here in Griffintown. Now, because so many famine refugees poured here into the neighborhood when it was a shanty town, it was decided to erect a Catholic church in 1854 because, of course, most of these refugees were Catholic. Now, if you look behind me where these benches are is where the pews used to be. And as you've probably noticed, I'm surrounded by the ruins of St. Anne's Church. And that's because it was unceremoniously demolished in 1970 after Jean Drapeau rezoned this neighborhood as an industrial zone. There simply weren't enough people to justify having a congregation anymore, which is unfortunate because you have to imagine how many weddings occurred here, how many communions, the confession of the many, many sins, and of course, we mustn't forget the funerals either. Now, when someone died here in Griffintown, their body was usually collected by Fran's Funeral Home. The corpse was embalmed and then shipped back here in a coffin, when it often had to be dragged up a narrow flight of stairs or even pulled through a window on a rope due to the ramshackle construction. But once it was inside, the coffin was propped in the upright position. They would put 3 candles around the feet and then decorate the front entrance of the home with black crepe paper to inform the other neighbors and residents that there was a 3-day wake in progress. And a 3-day wake was a party of sorts between the living and the dead. It wasn't only for reminiscing the dead, but it also involved copious amounts of drinking alcohol, singing, dancing, storytelling, and whatnot. And as I'm sure you can imagine, with a 3-day party of this sort, you know, things sometimes got a little out of hand. For example, sometimes they would take the corpse out of the coffin to take it for a last dance around the room before the burial. There was also a rather twisted prank they like to play here in the Griff. The Irish do have a good sense of humor. The famine survivors, that humor was darkened very much, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, here was the prank. Sometimes a guest would fall asleep at one of these parties after drinking too much. And so what they would do is they would remove the corpse from the coffin, put the slumbering guest into the coffin, and then using black boot polish, paint the skin all black, which was of course the final symptom of typhus before death. And so when the person woke up, they would think that they had contracted the typhus and had died. One man actually had to be taken away in an ambulance. But today the park is merely used by dog walkers and people doing yoga. All of these new residents are enjoying it in their own way, which is unfortunate because the ruins of St. Anne's Church are perhaps the best reminder of the old days when this was Canada's most notorious shantytown. Now, this is the site of Montreal's second famine cemetery right here at the Black Rock. There's actually approximately 6,000 Irish famine victims buried just here under my feet. In 1847, when the mayor John Easton Mills decided to move the site of the fever sheds, he had 22 more sheds erected directly behind you over here. Now, the area where I'm standing now was, of course, used as the cemetery. Now, approximately a decade later, they decided to start building the Victoria Bridge, which was the first bridge to span the St. Lawrence River, and the workers actually repurposed those fever sheds as housing. And as the bridge was nearing completion in 1859, the workers accidentally unearthed some of the victims here from the cemetery. They stopped all work and they said, we're not going to finish this bridge until the cemetery is properly commemorated. And so a team dredged up this 5-ton granite boulder from the bottom of the St. Lawrence River and affixed it here on this pedestal and engraved these words here into the stone, which were essentially to preserve from desecration the remains of the 6,000 victims buried in the vicinity. Now, unfortunately, this site has been desecrated again and again and again throughout history. As you can see right now, we're in the middle of an industrial zone. So I'll just give you a few examples of what happened over the years. First of all, they refused to cede this land to the Catholic Church. It was given to the Anglican Church because it was a British company, which meant that the Irish had no control over their own cemetery. The Anglicans allowed it to become overgrown with weeds and whatnot. The Redemptorist priests began marching here, and then the Ancient Order of Hibernians in the late 1800s, so they could properly commemorate the stone. Now, in the early 1900s, the Grand Trunk Railway purchased the site and decided the stone had to go so they could lay down more railroad tracks. In the dead of night, the stone was removed from the site and brought down on a rail car to St. Patrick's Square where it was installed. The Irish community was outraged. It took a full 10 years to return it here to the site after petitioning the railway commissioners in Ottawa. There's more. In the 1940s, as they were digging, they pulled up all sorts of bodies as they were digging a construction tunnel. This did prove that there was a cemetery, something the Grand Trunk tried to deny. Then for Expo 67, the city wanted to remove the rock so they could build this highway. The Irish community refused, and so they agreed upon a split solution, which means there's now highways running on either side of the rock, and it's in the middle of a traffic island. And perhaps the worst one of all happened just last year. The REM Railway decided that they needed to plant a concrete pylon for their monorail right into the heart of the cemetery, digging up 14 of our ancestors and sending them to a laboratory where they are right now. I'm a member of a group called the Irish Monument Park Foundation, and we worked on the file. We wrote academic papers, held conferences, did exhibitions, lobbied people, did research and so forth. And we thought we were getting somewhere, but then suddenly Hydro-Quebec bought all of this land all of a sudden because they need to build a new electrical substation to power the REM and all the new condos in Griffintown. We thought we'd lost the battle, but thank God for us, Hydro-Quebec actually has a lot of experience from flooding Indigenous burial grounds and whatnot, with their teams of archaeologists, public relations crews and so forth. And so they met with our community, and we actually got them to agree to cede a large parcel of this land to create the world-class park that we actually want. And so it does appear that it's going to happen. Since then, there's been a lot of talk at City Hall about even moving Bridge Street off of the cemetery. And so these are things that we're hoping are going to happen in the near future. And so basically, this concludes our tour today at the Black Rock. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things about the Irish famine's impact here in Montreal. And last but not least, I also wanted to give a plug to the Ancient Order of Hibernians, who does a Walk to the Stone the last Sunday of every May to commemorate our dear ancestors. This year, only 2 of the members went, my friends Fergus Keys and Victor Boyle, to install the wreath. Because of the COVID, they had to cancel it. But hopefully next year it will be back on schedule, and I invite you to join us then.
Do I need to unmute myself? No, you've unmuted me. All right, so there you have it. That was Donovan's film that we shot last year. And of course, we were expecting last year that everything would be okay by now, but it isn't. We're still in a situation where there's a lot of confinement. But fortunately, this year we were able to get permission, or he's able to get permission for his company to have tour groups of up to 25 people. So that's the situation there. I'm sorry, I've got something on my screen. Let me just close it. Thank you. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the film. It's, as I said, we did it last year. Bloomsday produced it. And the filmmaker was Sid Zanferlin. Sid is a very good friend of mine. He's a filmmaker, and I've worked with him in the past. He used to be, if any of you remember, when he was 17, he was a rock musician. He was in a group called Me, Mom, and Morgenthaler. So that's Sid Zanferlin. He was the director and the editor, and he brought in a friend of his named Hong Nguyen to be the cinematographer. So the 2 of them went around with Donovan. Took them all day, 8 hours, to shoot that film, making sure they got the right angles and everything. Fortunately, it was a beautiful day, as you can see. So that's the film, and if you ever want to see it again, it's available on our YouTube channel, and also I believe on Donovan's channel. If you like that Irish music that you heard, that was provided by Boomerang. Boomerang is a 3-person group of Irish musicians. Kate Bevan Baker, oh my goodness, I've forgotten the other woman's name, and Dave Gossage. Kate is a classically trained violinist who also fiddles, and they are just terrific. They're local, and she's got a doctorate, and they have recently signed a contract with music companies. So they're worth checking out. Let me spell it for you. It's Boomerang, just like you would say in Australia, but it's spelt B-U, accent grave, M-A-R-A-N-G, B-U-M-A-R-A-N-G, rather than B-O-O. So that's it. That's the film. And it really is a heck of a story. So I want to thank you very much for watching it with me today. I hope you'll join us this afternoon at 2 o'clock. We've got a concert coming up. I've just completed writing the sort of continuity for it. Dennis Trudeau, as he did last year, is going to be our host. And we have 3 very interesting writers who'll be reading from their books. One is Peter Behrens, who won the Governor General's Award for his first novel, The Law of Dreams, about the famine and about immigration. His main character lands exactly where Donovan was just talking about. So it's going to be very interesting. And Martina Brannigan is going to be reading from a translation of a book that she translated it called Fanette. It's a series of books by Suzanne Aubry, written in French. And she's up to 8 books in the series. It's incredibly popular. It's sold over 100,000 copies. And Fanette is a young Irish orphan who arrived at the same time in Quebec City. Her parents died on the ships, and she has to make her way. We've also got music that's inspired by the 3 main characters out of Ulysses: Leopold Bloom, Molly Bloom, and Stephen Dedalus. So tomorrow we've got some very high-powered academics who will be joining us for papers about Joyce and his works, always on the theme of origins. We've got 2 sessions. One's at 10 in the morning, one's at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then Tuesday at 10 a.m., we've got cultural historian Kerry McElroy. She's going to be speaking to this really cool guy. He's a podcaster in Ireland named Cian Gill. They're going to be talking on the origins of Irishness in cinema. And at 2 o'clock, it's Spotlight on Anne Lewis, a journalist, a former journalist whom you may recall from CTV. And she's now writing experimental fiction. Experimental fiction. She writes some sort of nonfiction memoir stuff. She's taken up painting again. And the most exciting thing is she has written a memoir of Leonard Cohen, and it's going to be published in 2023 by Simon & Schuster, which is a pretty big coup. And she's going to be reading a little bit from that and talking to Dennis Trudeau about some of her writing. And then at 5:30, get ready, we have got Jonathan Chung from Appetite for Books, who's going to be coming on, and he's going to be baking soda bread. On our website, you have all of the list of ingredients and all of the equipment that you need to bake the soda bread. So it's kind of bake along with Jonathan. My idea is, if you start baking at 5:30 with Jonathan, you've already got your oven preheated to 425, and you shove the dough in at 6 o'clock, 6:10, takes half an hour to cook. You can have it cooled and ready to eat at 7:30. And there may still be some left for breakfast, but I doubt it because it's going to be so delicious. Anyway, let me just check. I see we've got a question here. Is there a map of the tour? Ah, that is interesting. No, not that I know of. All I can suggest is that you watch the video again and see Donovan, or go on Donovan's website. He has lots of different tours, and there may be something there. I think if you wander around Griffintown, you can probably find St. Anne's Church. I sometimes go on the bus, the 35 bus that goes along there, so I've seen some of those places. Yeah, very, very good question. And maybe it's something that we could put together to have available alongside the film. It would be useful. Thank you for the suggestion. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? So I was going on and on about what's happening on Tuesday. So Tuesday ends with Jonathan Chung. That's at 5:30. Then you can have a nice dinner with the soda bread. And on Wednesday, of course, Wednesday is Bloomsday. It's the 16th of June. It is the famous day that Leopold Bloom went on his odyssey around Dublin and came home to his wife, Molly, at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's the day that we do the readings. And that's the day that all around the world, at over 60 cities around the world, crazy people like ourselves get together and read excerpts from the book. In Toronto, they have a special walk. They've designated certain locations along in the beaches area of Toronto as one is 7 Eccles Street and one is the pub that the men go to. Of course, they're not really pubs, they're not really a house, but they've just designated this, and the actors go along and the public goes along with them, and they read standing in front of these places. Anyway, that's what they do in Toronto. Here in Montreal, because of the situation, we're still on Zoom. We've got all our readers standing by, ready to read on Wednesday in the morning, and then in the afternoon. That's from, let's see, from 11 to 1:10, very, very scheduled. And then at 2 o'clock, I come on with my friend Geraldina. She's a pianist, and she's going to play some of the tunes that are relevant to Molly Bloom and to Ulysses. And I'm going to read excerpts from from Molly Bloom's Reverie, the final chapter of Ulysses, chapter 18, the Penelope chapter, which is over 24,000 words long with no punctuation. Well, no, it's not quite true. There are eight sentences, so there are 8 periods. The rest of it you have to figure out for yourself. So that's what I'm going to do, not read the whole thing because it would take 5 hours. I'll be reading for about 3/4 of an hour. Sponsorship and contributions mean that our online events such as this are free. We're always happy to accept donations. So if you're inclined, you can press the button on our website for Canada Helps, and they'll issue you a tax receipt. Now, I just want to check. There's another question here. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this. Well, my goodness, I'm thrilled to do it. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us. I understand that there are a number of people watching on YouTube live, and there's a group on Zoom where there are 6 people watching one device. So that's what we like to hear. I think I'll wrap it up unless there are any more questions. I really, I'd love to answer questions about Bloomsday. I can't really answer any questions about the tour or much of the history. You know, I just know what I know. I'm certainly not nearly as well informed as Donovan. Isn't he amazing? He just, you know, he's just a font of information. And I'm very interested in his take as well on the whole business of the post-colonial era and the upset that's been caused by the revisionist history and all of this stuff. And, you know, our toppling our great men. Maybe we'll put up some statues of great women in their place. All right, ladies and gents, thank you very much for being with me this morning. I hope you can join us at 2 p.m. for our concert. It's going to be amazing. Thank you very much.